My name is Elena Marquez, and I will never forget the day I realized that silence can be the most powerful form of warfare. I was 34, standing in a high-ceilinged conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. It was the quarterly strategy meeting at Northstar Logistics, the company I'd joined 5 years earlier when layoffs were sweeping the entire industry. I'd spent months developing a plan to overhaul our supply chain operations, projecting over $3 million in annual savings. My slides were clean, my numbers were precise. When I finished my presentation, I felt a cautious surge of pride. That lasted about 10 seconds. At the head of the table, Victor Hale, my department manager, didn't even look at my handouts. He leaned back in his chair with the same expression he always wore when I spoke, thinly veiled contempt. "This is unnecessarily convoluted," he announced, addressing the entire room. "Elena, you need to understand your role here. Don't try to impress people with ideas above your experience level." Then he smiled faintly and turned to the next agenda item, as if I hadn't spent 3 months building a framework that could transform our operations. I felt my face go hot. All around the table, no one met my eyes. Not even James Keller, who had once told me privately that he admired my work ethic. After the meeting, my proposal binder sat unopened in the center of the table. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the weight of my ambition and the quiet understanding that it would never matter to Victor. Later that afternoon, I sat in my cubicle replaying the moment in my mind, cataloging the reactions of my colleagues. Most were carefully neutral, unwilling to get involved. A few looked embarrassed for me, but none of them said a word. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning, that Victor would spend the next 2 years systematically erasing every contribution I made. That day marked the first crack in the wall I'd built around my optimism. I joined Northstar Logistics at 29, overqualified and a little desperate. I held a master's degree in supply chain optimization, but the recession meant the only positions available were far below my skill level. Victor had interviewed me with a thin smile, explaining that he was taking a risk on someone who didn't have real-world experience in his opinion. I found out later that he'd hired 3 men with less education at higher pay grades the same month. Still, I convinced myself that if I worked hard enough, my results would speak for themselves. During my first year, I overhauled the inventory tracking system for our Asia-Pacific shipments, reducing delays by 22%. When I presented the improvements at our department meeting, Victor nodded, then announced, "I'm glad my revised process is working well." I opened my mouth to correct him, but caught the warning glance from Paula Chen, my neighbor in the next cubicle. Afterward, she pulled me aside and said gently, "That's just how he is. If you come up with something good, it becomes his idea. It's better to let it go." I wanted to believe she was exaggerating, but 6 months later it happened again, and again. Each time my work was dismissed publicly or quietly rebranded as Victor's innovation. Each time I swallowed my frustration and told myself that patience would eventually be rewarded. What I didn't know was that patience without strategy only leads to more exploitation. If you'd asked me back then, I would have said I was handling it well. After all, I was still showing up early, staying late, and delivering consistent results that no one could dispute, at least on paper. But no amount of discipline prepared me for the way Victor Hale wielded power. He didn't raise his voice or hurl insults. He didn't need to. His most effective weapon was quiet dismissal, an unspoken suggestion that I was simply not worth acknowledging. The pattern became predictable. Whenever I submitted a proposal, he'd glance at the first page, then set it aside with a weary sigh. "This feels premature," he'd say. "Maybe in a few years you'll understand the bigger picture." Or, "Let's leave strategy to those with more experience. Focus on the tasks you're given." Then he'd hand the same project to James Keller, the 26-year-old he'd promoted over me 6 months after I trained him. James was polite enough. He never gloated. But he also never questioned why he was constantly rewarded for work that had begun on my desk. I tried to advocate for myself during performance reviews. I sat across from Victor, listing every metric I'd improved: delivery times, error rates, vendor compliance percentages. He'd nod absently and scribble a few words on my evaluation form. "You're reliable, Elena," he'd say, "but you need to manage your expectations. You lack the strategic thinking required at higher levels." When I asked what that meant, he smiled in a way that made my stomach sink. "It means you should focus on execution, not direction." And just like that, the conversation was over. A few weeks later, HR called me in to sign my annual performance review. I skimmed the document, feeling my throat tighten. Strengths: dependable, detail-oriented, areas for improvement, demonstrates difficulty accepting authority, tends to overreach beyond current role. Overreach. That word clung to me like a stain. I didn't know how to explain to HR that the overreach they cited was simply ambition, mischaracterized by a man who felt threatened by it. That was the moment I realized something important. I couldn't change Victor. I couldn't shame him into acknowledging my work, and I couldn't convince HR to see past the performance reports he controlled. But I could make a different plan. That spring, Northstar's largest client threatened to end their contract after a series of late shipments cost them millions. Victor convened an emergency department meeting to find someone to blame. We gathered in the windowless conference room while he paced the carpet, voice rising with each sentence. "This is unacceptable," he barked. "Do you realize the damage this does to our reputation? Our clients don't care about your excuses." I studied the printed reports I'd brought with me, heart beating so hard I felt dizzy. I knew exactly where the breakdowns were happening. I had data to prove it. I raised my hand. "Victor," I said, voice steadier than I felt, "I've analyzed 6 months of delivery logs. 90% of the delays are linked to 3 specific vendors. I've prepared a plan to address it without increasing costs." Silence. Everyone stared at me, then back at Victor. He took the report from my hand without looking at me. After glancing at the first page, he let it flutter onto the table. "We don't have time for your amateur analyses," he said slowly, each word sharper than the last. "This is a serious matter, not an opportunity for you to showcase your personal projects." He turned to the group. "Anyone else have input?" My cheeks burned as I tried to process what had just happened. I had evidence that could solve the problem. But once again, I'd broken the unspoken rule. Never threaten Victor's authority by offering real solutions. When no one spoke up, he dismissed the meeting. As I gathered my papers, Paula Chen brushed my arm gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know you're right." But being right had never been enough here. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the ceiling long after the dishes were done. I thought about all the times I'd told myself that if I just worked harder, he'd eventually respect me. It was a lie. Victor's power came from convincing everyone, including me, that he was the only one who mattered. And in that moment, a quiet conviction settled in my chest. I wouldn't try to fight him head-on. I would outlast him. Not with confrontation, with evidence, with results so undeniable that no amount of gatekeeping could bury them. After that humiliating meeting, I stopped trying to convince Victor Hale of anything. It was clear he wasn't interested in improvement, only control. So I redirected my energy. If leaving Northstar wasn't an option, I would have to create leverage from within. I started small. Over the next few weeks, I began reconnecting with colleagues across the building, people I'd helped in passing, people who had seen my work quietly solve problems without fanfare. One afternoon, I brought coffee to Talia Romero, a financial analyst I'd chatted with a few times by the elevators. "I heard you're dealing with discrepancies in the billing reports," I said gently. "I had similar issues when reconciling our supplier invoices. Would it help if I showed you a spreadsheet I built? Her eyes widened in relief. That would be amazing. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a conversation, a small offer, but it started something. Next, I reached out to Dominic Hughes in IT. I know the tracking system doesn't sync with finance, I told him. What if I designed a workaround? You could test it in parallel. He looked surprised. You'd be willing to share that? Of course. It became my routine, quietly offering practical solutions without asking for credit. At first, I told myself this was just self-preservation. But as the weeks passed, I realized I was doing something bigger. I was planting seeds in every corner of the company. Seeds that would grow into a network of allies who had seen firsthand what I could accomplish. Meanwhile, in our department, Victor kept assigning me busy work. He called it foundational support, which was his polite way of saying he didn't trust me with strategy. But the irony was, while he ignored me, I was refining every process that touched his metrics. Talia started using my reconciliation templates. Dominic implemented my tracking workaround. Paula adapted my vendor scoring system for her own reporting. Quietly, invisibly, the company's operations began improving in ways Victor couldn't explain, and certainly hadn't initiated. One evening, I stayed late to finish a batch of freight analysis reports. Paula popped her head over the cubicle wall. You know, she said softly, James has been bragging that he's the reason the billing delays have dropped by 30%. I almost laughed. Of course he has. But everyone in finance knows it was you. I looked up from my laptop, exhaustion settling behind my eyes. It doesn't matter, I said, though I wished it did. Paula studied me carefully. It will, she said after a moment. Eventually, it always does. She was right, though I didn't believe it yet. A month later, Northstar's parent company announced it had entered acquisition talks with Orion Supply Group, a massive logistics conglomerate headquartered in Chicago. The news spread through the building like wildfire. Rumors of layoffs, restructurings, and reorg charts filled every whispered conversation in the break room. Victor called a department meeting to reassure everyone. I've been told we're a key asset, he said, projecting calm. They'll look to our leadership for continuity. I sat in the back, listening to him list every process improvement he'd championed. Every single one of them was mine. Paula caught my eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. I looked down at my notes, fighting the old familiar feeling of defeat. But this time, it didn't stick. Because I'd finally realized something. Victor could keep telling whatever story he wanted, but when Orion's team started peeling back the layers, the truth would be impossible to hide. That afternoon, I sat alone in my cubicle and opened a new folder on my computer. Documentation. Process improvements. Unofficial. I began organizing every spreadsheet, every report, every piece of analysis I'd created over the last 2 years. I included timestamps, version histories, and email trails. I compiled feedback from Talia, Dominic, Paula, and every other colleague who had used my solutions. It took hours. But when I finally closed the folder, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Prepared. I didn't know exactly when, but I knew my moment was coming. And this time, I wouldn't be empty-handed. A few weeks later, Orion Supply Group finalized the acquisition. Emails flooded our inboxes about synergies and integration roadmaps. Corporate speak everyone knew meant one thing: restructuring. Victor reacted exactly as I expected. He called an urgent department meeting and stood in front of us, chest puffed out. Effective immediately, all data about departmental performance will go through me, he declared. I'll be preparing a comprehensive report for Orion's transition team. I watched him pace, voice full of forced authority. Our focus is to show leadership, he said. I'll need everyone's cooperation. In that moment, it was clear he planned to take credit for every success and bury any evidence that challenged his version of the story. I looked over at Paula. Her expression said everything. This was his last stand. The next day, my phone rang just as I was cataloging outdated equipment, an assignment Victor had given me under the guise of asset preparation. "This is Elena," I answered, expecting another request for inventory logs, but the voice on the line was unfamiliar, a woman with a clear, confident tone. "Elena Marquez?" "Yes. This is Samantha Price, Director of Innovation with Orion Supply Group. Could you come to conference room B in 15 minutes? My stomach flipped. "Yes, of course." I hung up and took a steadying breath. The conference room was on the top floor, reserved for senior leadership. I had never been invited up there. When I walked in, 3 people sat around a polished oak table. Samantha Price, who had called me. A man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Daniel Rhodes, head of global operations. And another executive, Jonas Patel, Orion's COO. They each had a laptop open, and as I glanced at their screens, my breath caught. Spreadsheets, diagrams, templates, every single one of them mine. Daniel looked up first. "You designed these systems?" I swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes." He exchanged a look with Samantha. "We've spent the last 2 weeks mapping processes here," Samantha explained. "Your frameworks are implemented in 6 departments, yet we can't find any record that they were formally adopted." I felt my pulse in my throat. "They weren't," I said carefully. "And why is that?" Jonas asked. I chose my words with precision. My manager has his own philosophy about departmental direction. These were solutions I created to address specific operational problems colleagues were experiencing. The room went quiet as they processed that. For the next hour, they asked increasingly specific questions. How did you design this vendor scoring system? What data informed your freight optimization models? Why did on-time deliveries improve by 20% after you introduced this workflow? I answered everything calmly, watching them take notes. They never mentioned Victor by name. They didn't have to. The evidence was sitting right there in black and white. Metrics that proved my unofficial systems outperformed the ones Victor claimed were his. As the meeting wrapped up, Samantha closed her laptop and looked me in the eye. "Elena, do you mind if we contact you again for additional clarification?" "Of course," I said. "Good," Daniel added, his expression thoughtful, "because I suspect this is just the beginning." Over the next 2 weeks, they called me into 5 more meetings. Sometimes it was just Daniel and Samantha. Sometimes it was Orion's entire operational integration team. Each time they asked me to explain the same thing in slightly different ways, cross-referencing data, verifying timelines. Each time, I told the truth. I created the systems. I shared them freely. I never claimed credit publicly because doing so would have been futile under Victor's leadership. By the end of the 2nd week, word was spreading. Paula slipped me a note at lunch. "They know. Everyone is talking about it." I read those 2 words. They know. And for the first time in years, I felt a crack in the wall Victor had built around my reputation. Meanwhile, Victor was completely oblivious. He was too busy drafting elaborate reports, trying to prove he deserved to keep his role. Every morning he would stride past my cubicle, pretending he didn't notice the frequent calls I was receiving from Orion's team. He must have assumed I was helping with asset lists or vendor audits. He never once asked what the meetings were really about, and I never offered to explain. The company-wide announcement was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Over 200 employees packed into the main hall. Victor sat near the front, papers neatly stacked in front of him, his suit pressed so perfectly it looked starched. I sat near the back with Paula. My hands were steady, because I knew what was coming, even if Victor didn't. The air in the main hall was tense as employees settled into folding chairs. It was the first all-hands meeting since the merger became official, and no one knew what to expect. Layoffs, restructuring, promotions. Victor sat near the front, surrounded by department heads he'd always treated like an audience for his monologues. Every few minutes, he adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, glancing around to see who was watching him. He didn't look at me. I don't think it even occurred to him that I might have any reason to be noticed. At exactly 3 p.m., Samantha Price and Daniel Rhodes stepped onto the stage. Samantha spoke first. "We've spent the past 6 weeks evaluating processes, teams, and contributions," she began. "Our goal has been to identify not only operational strengths, but the people behind them." A ripple of murmurs spread across the audience. Victor's back straightened. He looked so sure he was about to be praised. Daniel cleared his throat. "Today, we're announcing key leadership roles that will guide our integrated logistics operation forward," he said. A large projection screen flickered to life behind them, displaying the title, Director of Integrated Logistics, Pacific Region. Victor folded his hands on his lap, chin lifted slightly. Samantha continued. "This individual has demonstrated extraordinary initiative, creating systems that improved efficiency across 6 departments and directly contributed to our most successful client retention metrics." Victor nodded once, modestly lowering his gaze as if he were preparing to look surprised. I could almost see the speech rehearsing itself in his head. Daniel smiled slightly before reading the name. "Please join us in congratulating Elena Marquez." The room fell absolutely silent. I felt Paula's hand close over mine, squeezing hard. It took me a second to stand. My legs felt almost weightless. Applause began, first tentative, then gathering momentum until the room was filled with it. I walked slowly down the aisle, past colleagues who were staring in open shock. As I reached the front, I saw Victor's expression shift in real time. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, fear. Because in that moment, he understood what he'd never imagined possible. All those ideas he'd called overreach, all those proposals he'd ridiculed, they had been noticed. And they were the reason I was now the person standing on this stage. Samantha shook my hand, her grip steady. "You earned this," she said quietly. I turned to face the crowd, heart pounding. I didn't need to look at Victor again. I already knew what I'd see. That Monday was my first day as director. I arrived early, the building still hushed in pre-dawn quiet. My new office was bright and orderly, a fresh notepad waiting on the desk. At precisely 9 a.m., a knock sounded at my door. Victor stood there holding a leather portfolio against his chest. "We should discuss the transition," he said, voice carefully neutral. "I've prepared some notes on departmental priorities." I gestured for him to sit. "Actually," I said, "I'd like to hear your vision first. What improvements would you implement if resources weren't a concern?" He blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "Well," he began, "I believe in optimizing cross-departmental collaboration and refining our vendor management processes." He talked for nearly 15 minutes, stringing together buzzwords with no specifics. I took notes without interrupting. When he finally stopped, I closed my pen. "Interesting," I said. "One more question. Why was the supply chain overhaul I proposed last quarter dismissed without evaluation?" He shifted uncomfortably. "That proposal wasn't fully developed. It needed more refinement." "Interesting," I repeated, sliding a folder across the desk. "This is Orion's assessment of that same proposal. They estimate implementing it will save $4.3 million annually." His face flushed. "Elena, I've always recognized your potential," he said quickly. "Perhaps there was a miscommunication." I held up a hand. I'm not interested in revisiting the past. I'm interested in what comes next. His shoulders slumped. The following day, I held a department-wide strategy meeting. I outlined my plans. A transparent attribution system for every project. Clear pathways for career progression. A culture that valued contribution over hierarchy. I watched as the same people who'd once looked away from me lifted their heads. When I finished, I opened the floor to questions. Victor raised his hand, voice unsteady. I'd like to understand my role in this new structure. I met his gaze without blinking. You'll have the same opportunity to contribute as everyone else, I said evenly. But moving forward, credit will go where it's earned. There was no anger in my voice, no need. Everyone could see who had built the foundation we now stood on, and who had tried to bury it. Victor didn't last long after that first strategy meeting. He tried, in his way, to maintain the illusion of authority. But the culture was changing too quickly for him to keep up. In a department that now prized transparency over politics, there was no space left to hide behind buzzwords or borrowed credit. 2 weeks after our meeting, he submitted a short resignation letter. He didn't come to say goodbye. He didn't need to. By then, everyone understood exactly why he was leaving. The morning after his departure, I arrived early. I walked the quiet hallways, taking in the sense of possibility that came with every empty desk and fresh start. In the conference room, Paula was already arranging chairs for our first team workshop. When she saw me, she smiled, an unguarded, genuine smile I'd never seen from her before. I still can't believe it, she admitted. You could have fired him in front of everyone. You could have humiliated him the way he did you. I leaned against the doorframe, thinking back to all the times I'd imagined that very scenario, standing over Victor while he packed his things into a cardboard box. I thought about it, I admitted. Why didn't you? I looked around the room. Because it wasn't necessary, I said softly. Victor's defeat hadn't come from anything I said. It had come from everything I built. Over the next 3 months, I focused on reconstruction. I promoted Paula to senior operations manager, recognizing the countless times she'd quietly supported me when no one else would. I sat down with James Keller, who had once been promoted over me, and had the conversation neither of us had dared attempt before. I know Victor put you in an impossible position, I told him. I'm not interested in blame, but I am interested in knowing what you want for your career. His shoulders dropped, relief washing over his features. I just want to contribute, he admitted, without feeling like I'm stepping on someone else's work. Then, let's start fresh, I said. One of my first official acts as director was implementing our new transparent attribution protocol. Every project now included detailed records of who proposed each idea, who developed and refined it, who executed it. Performance reviews were tied to actual documented contributions, not perceptions or alliances. Within weeks, morale started to shift. People who had been too afraid to speak up began offering suggestions. Quiet contributors finally felt seen. And the opportunists, the ones who had flourished under Victor, found themselves exposed by the simple power of clear records. About 6 weeks into this new era, I was called to present our results to Orion's executive board. In the same conference room where I'd once been invited as a silent observer, I now stood as the department head. Samantha and Daniel were there, along with several unfamiliar faces from corporate. I walked them through our metrics: efficiency up 35%, error rates down 40%, client satisfaction the highest it had been in 5 years. When I finished, Daniel leaned forward. What would you say is the secret to these improvements? I didn't hesitate. Recognition, I said simply. People will do extraordinary things when they know their efforts won't be erased. Around the table, a few executives shifted uncomfortably. I knew they recognized themselves in Victor. But I wasn't speaking for their benefit. I was speaking for every overlooked person in every department across our company. A month later, I received a notification in my email, an application for an open associate director position. The name at the top of the resume stopped me cold. Victor Hale. I sat back in my chair, letting the moment settle. For a heartbeat, I considered rejecting it immediately, but that would have been too easy and too much like the version of myself Victor had tried to shape. Instead, I forwarded it to HR with a simple note: schedule an interview. I will conduct it personally. He arrived precisely on time, wearing the same carefully pressed suit he'd worn the day he dismissed my first proposal as overreach. When he saw me sitting alone at the conference table, his expression flickered. "Elena," he said, recovering his composure, "I wasn't expecting you." "I interview all candidates for director-level positions," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. He sat slowly, clearing his throat. "I'd like to discuss how my experience could serve the team," he began. I nodded once. "Let's start by discussing your contributions to the supply chain improvements implemented over the past 2 years. Color drained from his face. He knew exactly where this was going. For 45 minutes, I asked precise, neutral questions about every claim on his resume. For every inflated accomplishment, I produced documentation, emails, drafts, meeting minutes, showing the real origin of the ideas. By the end, his voice was hoarse, his gaze fixed on the table. I closed my notebook. "One final question," I said evenly. "If you were hired, how would you improve the systems you once called unnecessarily complex?" He looked up, and in his eyes I saw something that surprised me. Not defiance, but regret. "I would start by understanding them," he said quietly. I nodded once. "Thank you for your time." 2 days later, he withdrew his application. In the months that followed, I was promoted to Vice President of Global Operations. The transparent attribution protocol became standard policy across all divisions. When people asked what had driven such dramatic change, I always said the same thing. It was never about revenge. It was about building something so strong, so fair, that no one could ever again mistake someone else's brilliance for their own. If you are sitting in a cubicle right now, wondering if your work matters, if anyone will ever see what you're capable of, I hope you remember this. The best revenge isn't humiliating someone who underestimated you. It's rising so high they become irrelevant to your story. It's creating something so undeniably excellent that their dismissal becomes their greatest regret. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, share your experience in the comments below. And remember, your place isn't defined by anyone else's limitations. It's defined by the legacy you choose to build.